The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow across the quiet streets of Willow Creek, a small town where everyone seemed to know one another, or at least thought they did. Michael walked out of the hospital where he worked, his white coat folded neatly over his arm. His day had been long, 12 hours of caring for patients, from elderly folks with weak hearts to children with broken arms. Despite his exhaustion, Michael carried the same calm, steady expression he always wore. Michael wasn't the kind of man who raised his voice or looked for trouble. At 45, he had learned that life was heavy enough without unnecessary fights. He believed in patience, in kindness, and in the quiet strength of dignity. To his co-workers, he was Dr. Michael, the man who stayed late to check one more chart. To his daughter Emily, he was Dad, the steady figure who never broke his promises. To himself, he was just a man trying to live a decent life. That evening, Michael slid into his old sedan, started the engine, and began his drive home. The streets were calm, lined with small shops closing for the night. The bakery owner was turning off her neon sign, and kids were riding their bikes down the sidewalk. Michael enjoyed these scenes. It reminded him why he had chosen to stay in Willow Creek despite better offers elsewhere. This was home, and he wanted Emily to grow up in a place that felt safe. But safety was not always what it seemed. 2 blocks from the gas station, flashing red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. The sharp sound of a police siren echoed down the street. Michael frowned softly, confused. He had not been speeding, and his car was in good condition. Still, he pulled over to the side, careful to keep both hands on the wheel. The patrol car came to a stop behind him, and out stepped Officer Daniel. Daniel was well known in Willow Creek, though not in the way Michael was. Where Michael's reputation was built on kindness, Daniel's was built on arrogance. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore his uniform like a costume of power. People in town whispered about him, stories of unnecessary stops, harsh words, and a smirk that always seemed to linger when others were left embarrassed. Daniel approached the driver's side window with slow, deliberate steps. He leaned down, his hand resting near his belt, and looked at Michael with narrowed eyes. "Well, well," Daniel said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Look who we have here." Michael kept his voice calm. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I was pulled over?" Daniel chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as if amused. "Why? Because I felt like it. You got a problem with that?" A couple walking their dog across the street slowed down, glancing at the scene. Michael noticed them but kept his gaze steady on the officer. "I don't want trouble," he said softly. "I'd just like to understand." Daniel leaned closer, lowering his voice but not enough to hide the sarcasm. "Understand? You think you get to ask me questions? You sit there quiet and you do as I say." Michael's jaw tightened, though his face remained calm. Years of dealing with angry patients and anxious families had trained him to stay composed under pressure. He was not a man who shouted, but inside something twisted. He knew he had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, stopped, mocked, and treated like a suspect for no reason. By now, a small group had gathered on the sidewalk. Teenagers pulled out their phones, recording the exchange. Their screens captured not only the flashing lights but also the smirk on Daniel's face and the quiet strength in Michael's posture. Daniel tapped the roof of the car. "Step out," he ordered. Michael hesitated, then slowly opened the door and stepped onto the street. His tall frame stood straight, his white shirt neatly tucked into his pants. He looked like exactly what he was, a professional man on his way home from work. But Daniel wasn't interested in appearances. "You drive this old car around town thinking you're somebody," Daniel said, his voice loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "Maybe you should spend less time acting important and more time fixing your ride." The words cut deeper than Daniel realized. Michael had saved for years to buy that car. It wasn't flashy, but it was reliable, and he was proud of it. It had taken him to countless night shifts, carried groceries home for Emily, and driven through storms when patients needed him. To hear it mocked as worthless was like hearing his effort dismissed. Still, Michael kept his composure. "Officer, I have all my papers in order. My car is fine. If you need to check, I'll provide whatever you ask." Daniel smirked again. "Oh, you're polite, aren't you?" "Always polite. That's what makes this fun." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. The woman with the dog whispered to her husband, "He hasn't done anything wrong." The teenagers kept recording, their eyes wide at the cruelty unfolding before them. Michael felt the weight of all those eyes, not on Daniel, but on him. He thought of Emily, of how she would react if she saw this video. Would she be ashamed? Would she cry? He tightened his grip on his folded coat, drawing strength from the thought of her smile. "I don't want to cause a scene," Michael said quietly. "Please let me go home." But Daniel wasn't finished. He circled the car slowly, inspecting it as if hunting for flaws. "Taillights fine, tires fine, registration stickers fine," he muttered loudly, pretending to search. Finally, he stopped, his eyes glinting with mockery. "Guess I just wanted to make sure you knew who's in charge around here." The words hung heavy in the air. Michael's silence was louder than any argument. He didn't shout, didn't raise a fist, didn't curse. He simply looked at Daniel with steady eyes, the kind that carried years of quiet endurance. And in that look, the crowd saw something powerful, not weakness, but strength. When Daniel finally waved his hand dismissively and said, "Get out of here," Michael nodded once, got back into his car, and drove away. But the story didn't end there, because the cameras had captured everything. The smirk, the mocking words, the calm dignity of a man who refused to be broken. And by nightfall, those videos would be everywhere. Michael drove home in silence, his heart heavy yet strangely clear. He had done nothing wrong, but something told him this moment was bigger than himself. What had happened on that street was not just about him. It was about every person who had been stopped, mocked, or treated unfairly and had stayed silent. Michael had not planned to be a symbol. He had only wanted to get home. But destiny had different plans. That night, Willow Creek was quieter than usual. Streetlights flickered on, shop doors locked, and the small town tucked itself into sleep. But while the streets rested, the internet did not. By 9 o'clock, the first video of Michael's encounter with Officer Daniel was posted online. It was shaky, recorded by a teenager's phone, but it showed everything clearly: the flashing lights, Daniel's smirk, the mocking words, and Michael's calm silence. Within minutes, the video spread across social media. 1,000 views turned into 10,000, then into 100,000. People everywhere watched the same few minutes of footage, shaking their heads, typing angry comments, and asking questions. "Who is this man?" someone wrote. "Why did the officer treat him like that?" another asked. "He didn't even raise his voice," someone else added. That's strength. Meanwhile, in a small house on Oak Street, Emily sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She was only 17, but she carried herself with a maturity beyond her years. She had grown up watching her father face long hours at the hospital, watching him fix broken sinks at home with the same patience he used to fix broken hearts at work. When she clicked the video and saw her father standing on that street, her heart sank. She pressed her hand to her mouth as the officer's mocking words filled the room. Her father stood tall, calm, and respectful, but the humiliation was clear. Emily's eyes filled with tears. She whispered to herself, "He didn't deserve this." Her phone buzzed with messages from friends. "Emily, is this your dad? Your father is all over the internet. People are saying he's a hero." Emily's hands shook as she typed back, "Yes, that's him." In the living room, Michael sat in his armchair, unaware of how far the video had already traveled. He had come home, hugged his daughter, eaten a simple dinner, and quietly said goodnight. He didn't speak of the encounter. He didn't want Emily to worry. But Emily couldn't sleep. She opened her door and walked softly to the living room, where the glow of the lamp lit her father's tired face. "Dad," she said gently, holding up her phone, "you need to see this." Michael looked at the screen, puzzled, and then watched the video play. His own image stared back at him, calm, steady, standing against flashing lights. He heard Daniel's mocking tone again, only this time through the voices of strangers online. His brows furrowed, and for the first time that day, he let out a deep sigh. "I didn't want anyone to see this," Michael murmured. "I didn't want it to spread." Emily sat beside him, her hand on his arm. "But people need to see it. They need to know what happened. You didn't do anything wrong, Dad. You stayed calm. You showed strength. People are already supporting you." Michael turned his gaze toward his daughter, her eyes full of both pain and pride, reminded him that this moment was no longer just his own. "Emily," he said softly, "sometimes silence is easier. Sometimes speaking out brings more trouble than peace." Emily shook her head, "Or sometimes silence hides the truth." And maybe Maybe this time it's bigger than us. By the next morning, news reporters had picked up the story. Local television showed clips of the video, headlines flashing, "Hospital doctor mocked during traffic stop." Officer faces scrutiny after viral video. Neighbors who had always greeted Michael politely now knocked on his door with casseroles, words of encouragement and questions about how he was doing. John, the town mechanic, came by with grease still on his hands. "Michael," he said, "this isn't the first time that officer's gone too far. People need to talk about it." "You gave them the courage." Michael shook his head gently. "I didn't give anything. I only wanted to go home." But John's words stayed with him. At the hospital, Michael walked down the hall in his white coat, hearing whispers from nurses and patients. Some clapped him on the back, others offered soft smiles. An elderly woman he had treated weeks before took his hand and said, "You didn't raise your voice, but you spoke louder than you think." Michael smiled politely, though his heart remained heavy. He had never wanted attention. Healing people was his calling, not standing in front of cameras. Yet everywhere he went, people now looked at him differently, not just as a doctor, but as a man who had shown dignity in the face of cruelty. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel sat in his patrol car scowling at the glowing screen of his phone. Every news site carried the story. His name was being spoken with anger, his smirk replayed millions of times. He muttered under his breath, "They're blowing this out of proportion. Just another traffic stop." But deep down, Daniel felt something he rarely admitted: fear. He had seen stories like this before in other towns, where an officer's arrogance caught the wrong spotlight. He told himself it would pass, that people would forget. But a part of him knew Willow Creek would not stay silent this time. By the third day, the town square was filled with quiet gatherings. People lit candles, not out of anger, but out of solidarity. They held signs that read, "Dignity matters. Respect for all. We stand with Michael." Michael stood at the edge of the square one evening, watching silently. He had not asked for this. Yet here were his neighbors, his patients, even strangers, all standing for something larger than him. His daughter Emily stood beside him, her hand tucked into his. "Dad," she whispered, "they're here because of you." Michael shook his head softly. "No, Emily. They're here because they've seen enough. I was only one moment, but maybe that moment gave them courage." He looked around at the candles glowing against the dark, at faces filled with hope and determination. He realized something important. Sometimes a person doesn't choose to be a symbol. Sometimes life chooses for them. And though Michael still carried the weariness of that night, he also carried something new: the knowledge that dignity, even in silence, could start a movement. The town of Willow Creek had always been quiet on the surface. People greeted one another with smiles, waved from porches, and gathered at the diner on Sunday mornings. But behind that small-town calmness, there were stories, unspoken, buried, forgotten. The video of Michael's encounter with Officer Daniel had stirred something powerful. For the first time, people felt they could speak about their own experiences. And once one voice rose, others followed. It began with John, the mechanic. John was a man in his 50s with weathered hands from years of repairing cars. He had kept his head down most of his life, avoiding trouble, focusing on his shop. But when he saw Michael standing strong in silence, something changed. He remembered the day 3 years earlier, when Daniel had pulled him over outside his own garage. "You think this junk is safe to drive?" Daniel had said, kicking the side of John's truck in front of customers. John had laughed nervously, saying nothing. He didn't want conflict. He wanted peace. But that day left a scar. Now, as reporters came to town, John spoke up. "That officer mocked me too," he told them. "He embarrassed me in front of my neighbors. I said nothing then, but I can't stay quiet now." Next came Sarah, the high school teacher. She stood before her class one morning, chalk in hand, when a news crew arrived at the school gates. The students whispered excitedly. Sarah hesitated, then stepped outside to speak. "My brother," she said, her voice trembling, "was stopped by Officer Daniel last year. He was walking home from work. Daniel accused him of trespassing right there on his own street. My brother tried to explain, but Daniel only laughed and told him to watch himself. We didn't file a complaint. We thought no one would believe us, but now people are listening." Her students, who had once thought of Daniel as just another officer, looked at her with wide eyes. They saw their teacher not only as an educator but as a sister, who had carried silent pain, the stories, spread like wildfire. An elderly man named Robert recalled being pulled over for a broken headlight that was perfectly fine. A young mother, Linda, spoke of how Daniel once questioned her harshly while her toddler cried in the back seat. Each story carried the same thread: humiliation, mockery, and a smirk that left wounds deeper than words. Michael listened to these voices with a heavy heart. He had never wanted to be the center of attention, yet here he was, watching as others found strength through his experience. His living room became filled with visitors, neighbors who wanted to share, journalists who wanted quotes, and community members who wanted guidance. Emily sat by his side, writing down names and stories, determined to keep a record.
"Dad," she said one evening, "this isn't just about you anymore."
"This is about all of us." Michael nodded slowly. "Yes, Emily, it is." Meanwhile, Officer Daniel grew restless. At the station, whispers filled the halls. Some officers avoided his gaze, while others offered awkward nods. The chief called him into the office. "Daniel," the chief said firmly, "this has gone too far. People are speaking out. This department is under the spotlight." Daniel scoffed. "It's nothing. Just people exaggerating." The chief shook his head. "It's not nothing. These are years of complaints, ignored, dismissed, and now uncovered. You may think you're untouchable, but the truth always finds its way out." For the first time, Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him. The badge he had worn like a shield now felt heavy, exposed. The town square became the center of gatherings. Candles were lit each night, not with anger, but with unity. Families came together holding signs with simple words: respect, dignity, truth. Michael attended quietly, never taking the stage, always standing among the people. Yet his presence spoke louder than any speech. People looked to him, not because he shouted, but because he stood tall in silence. One evening, John approached him with tears in his eyes. "Michael," he said, gripping his hand, "I wish I had your strength back then, but I was afraid." Michael shook his head gently. "You are strong now, John. That's what matters." Emily, standing nearby, watched her father with pride. She realized that strength was not always loud or forceful. Sometimes it was quiet, steady, and unshakable. The media attention grew. National outlets arrived, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Dr. Michael, they called him. The man who stayed calm. Reporters wanted interviews, talk shows wanted appearances, but Michael declined them all. "I am not here for fame," he told one reporter softly. "I am here for change." His words traveled as quickly as the video itself. People across the country began sharing their own stories online, inspired by his example. Hashtags filled with voices that had once been silent. But in Willow Creek, the weight of the past was heaviest. At the church on Main Street, Pastor William gave a sermon that Sunday unlike any other. The pews were full, the air heavy with emotion. "We are taught to forgive," the pastor said, his voice echoing against the walls. "But forgiveness does not mean silence. Silence allows pain to grow. Speaking truth is not rebellion, it is healing." The congregation nodded, many with tears streaming down their faces. Michael sat in the back, his hands folded, his heart both heavy and hopeful. That night, as Michael sat on the porch with Emily, the summer air carried the sound of crickets. Emily leaned against his shoulder. "Dad," she whispered, "do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" Michael paused, staring at the stars. "Yes," he admitted. "I wish I had just driven home quietly. I wish no one had seen. But then I think, maybe it was meant to be. Not for me, but for everyone who finally feels they can speak." Emily smiled softly. "Maybe that's your purpose, Dad, to give people a voice." Michael kissed the top of her head. "If that's true, Emily, then we must carry it with care. Change does not come from anger alone. It comes from truth, dignity, and unity." The night stretched on, but in Willow Creek the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with voices of the past, rising together at last. The town square of Willow Creek had always been a place of small celebrations, a farmer's market on Saturdays, parades on holidays, and concerts in the summer. But now it had become something else. Each night people gathered with candles, signs, and voices filled with determination. They weren't shouting angrily. They were standing together in quiet unity. Michael often stood among them, not as a leader, but as one of them. Yet his presence carried weight. People looked to him for calm, for guidance, for hope. He didn't ask for that role, but it was slowly being given to him. On a cool Friday evening, the square was more crowded than ever. Families came with children, teachers with students, workers still in uniforms, and elders holding walking sticks. The air buzzed with expectation. At the front, a small wooden stage had been set up, built by volunteers who wanted a space for voices to be heard. Emily stood at the edge of the stage, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. She had written down thoughts, not knowing if her father would ever agree to speak. "Dad," she whispered, tugging at his sleeve. "People want to hear from you, not from reporters, not from strangers. From you." Michael hesitated. His heart pounded in his chest. He had spent his life speaking in hospital rooms, not in front of crowds. But as he looked at the sea of faces, neighbors, co-workers, patients, friends, he realized they weren't asking for a speech. They were asking for truth. Slowly, Michael stepped onto the stage. The crowd quieted at once. Children stopped fidgeting. Cameras lowered. The air grew still. Michael took a deep breath. His voice, when it came, was steady and warm. "I never wanted attention," he began. "I am a doctor. My work is to heal, not to stand in front of lights and cameras. What happened to me was not unique. It was one moment caught on video, but what I have heard since then, the stories from so many of you, has shown me that this is bigger than one moment." The crowd listened closely. Some nodded. Others wiped away tears. "For years, many of you have carried quiet pain," Michael continued. "You were mocked, dismissed, treated unfairly, and you thought no one would believe you. But now you are speaking, and you are being heard." His eyes swept across the crowd. He saw John, the mechanic, standing tall. He saw Sarah, the teacher, holding her brother's hand. He saw the elderly and the young, all standing shoulder to shoulder. "This is not about anger," Michael said firmly. "It is about dignity. Every person deserves respect. Every person deserves to walk home, drive to work, or sit in peace without fear of being humiliated. Respect cannot be demanded by power, it must be earned by character." A murmur of agreement spread through the square. Some clapped softly, others whispered to each other. Michael paused, letting the words sink in. "I do not want revenge," he said. "I want change. Not for myself, but for my daughter, for your children, for every person who calls this town home. We cannot stay silent anymore. We must stand together, not to fight, but to build. Not to tear down, but to lift up. This is our chance to choose dignity over silence." For a long moment, the square was silent. Then slowly, applause began. First a few claps, then more, until the sound filled the air like thunder. People raised their candles higher, their faces lit with hope. Emily's eyes filled with tears as she watched her father step down from the stage. She whispered to herself, "That's my dad." The next day, Michael's words were replayed on news channels across the country. Clips of him speaking spread online, gathering millions of views. But unlike the first video, this one was different. It didn't show humiliation. It showed strength, unity, and vision. People from outside Willow Creek began sending messages of support. Letters arrived at the hospital, thanking Michael for his courage. Children drew pictures of candles and hearts, mailing them to his home. One letter came from a nurse in another state. "I saw the way you stood calmly," she wrote. "It gave me courage to speak about what I went through. Thank you." Michael read each message with quiet humility. He still didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had been forced into a moment he never wanted. But he also understood now that the moment had meaning. At the police department, the pressure grew heavier. The chief held meetings with the town council, reviewing years of ignored complaints. Files that had once gathered dust were now spread across desks. Officers who had kept silent began to speak up. Some admitted they had witnessed Daniel's mocking behavior but had been too afraid to challenge him. The chief, a man nearing retirement, admitted privately, "We failed this town by staying quiet." For Daniel, the walls were closing in. He drove through town, seeing his own face on posters and signs, not in honor but in shame. He muttered angrily to himself, telling anyone who would listen that people were overreacting. But deep down, he felt the weight of consequences approaching. Meanwhile, Willow Creek kept gathering. Each night the square filled, each night candles burned. But now the gatherings carried a new tone, not only pain but determination. One evening, Sarah, the teacher, stood on the stage and said, "I was silent once, but not anymore. My students deserve better." Another night, John, the mechanic, shared his story, his voice breaking. I thought being quiet would protect me, but it only gave more power to cruelty. Every voice added strength to the movement. Every story made silence weaker. One evening, after another gathering, Michael and Emily walked home together. The night was cool and the stars glimmered above them. "Dad," Emily said softly. "Are you scared?" Michael thought for a moment before answering. "Yes," he admitted. "Change is never easy, and when you stand for something, you become a target. But fear cannot guide us. Only truth can." Emily squeezed his hand. "I believe in you." Michael smiled. "Then we must believe in each other. That is how change comes." By the end of that week, Willow Creek was no longer the same quiet town it had been. It was awake. People were no longer whispering their stories in private. They were speaking them aloud. And they were not just speaking to one another, they were speaking to the world. Michael had not chosen this path. But as he walked among his neighbors, candles glowing in their hands, he realized something important. Sometimes a stand is not taken by choice. Sometimes it is placed before you, and you must decide whether to step forward or turn away. Michael had stepped forward, and because of that, an entire town was now standing with him. Willow Creek had changed. The once quiet town streets were now filled with conversations about justice, dignity, and truth. Michael's calm strength had inspired the community to speak openly about their experiences. Every corner of town seemed to carry a story waiting to be told, and the ripple effect reached beyond their small town borders. But with attention came consequences. Officer Daniel could no longer ignore the growing wave of voices demanding accountability. What had started as a single mocking moment on a street had now become an investigation into years of behavior. The chief of police, long aware of complaints that had never been acted upon, was forced to confront the truth. "Daniel," the chief said, calling him into his office once again, "the stories are piling up. There are complaints from years ago, recordings, witness statements, and now the community is demanding answers. This is no longer something we can dismiss." Daniel leaned back in his chair, trying to maintain the same arrogance he always wore. "It's just a video. People are overreacting." "Everyone's overreacting," the chief shook his head. "It's not overreaction. This is accountability. You have mocked, humiliated, and harassed members of this community for years, and now the truth has surfaced. You will have to face it." Daniel felt a cold knot in his stomach. For the first time, the badge that had once given him power felt heavy. He muttered under his breath, realizing that authority without respect could no longer protect him. Meanwhile, Michael continued his daily life at the hospital. He walked the halls with quiet confidence, greeted patients with warm smiles, and stayed committed to his work. Yet he now carried another role, a symbol for the town and for people far beyond Willow Creek. His days were no longer just about healing bodies, but also about inspiring courage. Emily walked beside him one afternoon as they left the hospital together. "Dad," she said, "people are talking about you everywhere. They're saying you didn't just defend yourself, you defended all of us." Michael shook his head softly. "I didn't choose to be a symbol, Emily. But if I can help others speak their truth, then I cannot step back." "Silence only protects wrongs," Emily smiled. "You're right. And that's why people love you." Back in the town square, nightly gatherings had grown. The community no longer met simply to share stories. They met to demand real change. People of all ages carried signs: justice with respect, accountability matters, we will be heard. Sarah, the teacher, had organized a small group of students to read letters from community members who could not attend. John, the mechanic, spoke about his experiences and urged others to do the same. Every voice built momentum, creating a wave that could not be ignored. When Michael finally spoke to the crowd that evening, his words were simple but powerful. "We are not here to punish," he said. "We are here to stand for truth, dignity, and fairness. This is bigger than anger. This is about building a town, a community, and a world where respect is earned and not demanded." The town's council held a public hearing. The square was filled with community members, reporters, and cameras. Michael sat quietly with Emily beside him, surrounded by neighbors who had once been silent. John, Sarah, Linda, and Robert were there as well, their faces determined. When Daniel appeared, he walked into the room with a forced confidence. But as he faced the crowd, he realized the weight of the truth. Every person he had mocked, every person he had humiliated, was now looking directly at him. The hearing began. Statements were read aloud. The witnesses described the fear and shame they had endured. Every voice strengthened the next. Daniel tried to interrupt, to laugh, to deflect, but the sheer number of people speaking out left him powerless. Finally, the chair of the council addressed him. "Officer Daniel, you have been given authority to protect this community, but authority without respect is dangerous. Your actions have caused harm, humiliation, and fear. This is your reckoning. You will face consequences and changes will be made to ensure this never happens again." Daniel's face paled. The room was silent except for the quiet sounds of pens writing, cameras clicking, and hearts beating. For the first time in his career, he realized that power was meaningless without integrity. Outside the building, Michael and Emily walked among the crowd. People whispered words of gratitude, shook his hand, and hugged him. He felt a weight lift, not because of revenge, but because the town had found its voice. Emily looked up at her father. "Dad, it's working." "People are listening. Things are changing," Michael nodded. "Yes, Emily, but this is just the beginning. Change is not a single moment. It's a journey, and we must keep walking it together." As they walked home through the quiet streets, Michael thought about the events of the past weeks. A single moment on a street corner had sparked a movement. What began as an act of mockery had grown into a call for truth and accountability. And though the road ahead was long, the first steps had been taken. That night, Michael sat on the porch, Emily beside him, listening to the distant sounds of the town. Candles from the square flickered in windows, and the air carried a sense of hope. The reckoning had begun, not with anger, but with courage, dignity, and the determination to build a better community. Michael whispered softly, "Justice is not about punishment. It's about making sure everyone knows their worth and that respect is never optional." Emily squeezed his hand. "I'll always remember that, Dad." And in Willow Creek, as stars sparkled above, the town slept a little more peacefully, knowing that accountability was real, courage was contagious, and dignity had finally found its voice. Willow Creek was no longer the same quiet town it had been before that viral video. The events of the past weeks had awakened the community. People no longer whispered their stories in private. They spoke them aloud with courage and pride. What had started as a single act of mockery had become a movement for respect, accountability, and dignity. Michael walked down the main street one morning, the sun casting long shadows over the pavement. Shops were opening, children walked to school, and neighbors waved from porches. Everything seemed peaceful, but Michael felt the weight of change in the air. He had never asked to become a symbol. He had only wanted to go home that night after work, tired and ready to rest. Yet here he was, walking among people who now looked at him with admiration, trust, and gratitude. Emily ran ahead of him, her school backpack bouncing against her shoulders. "Dad," she called, spinning around to smile. "Look, people are talking about the new community program we started." Michael followed her gaze to a small group of neighbors organizing a neighborhood watch and mentoring program for local teens. The movement had grown organically, fueled by the courage of those who had spoken up. Michael's moment of calm had inspired them to believe that even one person's actions could ripple through a whole town. He smiled softly. "I never thought it would reach this far," he said, shaking his head. "But maybe that's how change begins, quietly with a single act of truth." Meanwhile, Officer Daniel faced the consequences of his actions. The investigation had concluded and the results were clear. Multiple complaints over several years had been ignored, and his mocking behavior had caused real harm. He was relieved of his badge and removed from duty. The town watched as justice unfolded, not as revenge but as accountability. Daniel left the police station one evening carrying only a small box of personal items. He walked past the square and saw the people he had mocked. He noticed the calm determination in their eyes and the quiet dignity of Michael standing among them. The sight was humbling. For the first time, Daniel understood that authority without integrity was meaningless. At the hospital, Michael returned to his work with renewed purpose. Patients greeted him warmly, staff looked to him for guidance, and Emily often joined him during brief visits, helping with small tasks. But Michael noticed that the hospital itself seemed different now. Staff were more confident in speaking up, and teamwork was stronger. It was as if his actions outside the hospital had reminded everyone inside that courage mattered in every place, not just in moments of crisis. One afternoon, A young nurse named Rachel approached him quietly. "Dr. Michael," she said, "I wanted to thank you. After your speech and the attention you've brought to this town, I finally felt brave enough to report an issue at work that had been bothering me for months." "You gave me courage I didn't know I had." Michael smiled warmly. "Courage isn't mine alone, Rachel. It belongs to everyone who speaks their truth." The town square continued to serve as a gathering place, but now the meetings were for collaboration rather than protest. Community programs were organized to mentor young people, improve local schools, and strengthen relationships between residents. The candlelight gatherings had transformed into workshops, planning sessions, and celebrations of achievements. People spoke not only about the past but also about how to ensure respect and dignity were maintained in the future. One evening, Michael stood on the small wooden stage in the square. He looked at the crowd, a mix of familiar faces, neighbors, friends, and students, and realized how far they had come. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said. "It starts with a single voice, a single action, a single choice to do what is right. I never expected my moment on that street to matter so much, but together, we have turned it into something bigger than all of us, and that is the true power of a community that stands for dignity, respect, and truth." Emily, standing beside him, held his hand tightly. She had grown so much in the past weeks, learning what courage and integrity truly meant. "Dad," she whispered, "you didn't just help people stand up. You helped them believe they could." Michael nodded softly. "Sometimes all it takes is one person to show what's right. Then others follow. That is how real change begins." Months passed. The programs in Willow Creek flourished. Young people attended mentoring sessions. Neighbors supported one another, and the police department underwent reforms to ensure accountability and fairness. The town had healed in ways that were both visible and invisible. Michael had returned fully to his work, but he was now a man known not only for his medical skill but also for his courage, humility, and unwavering dignity. Emily often walked with him after school, discussing plans for the future. She had learned that standing up for truth was not always easy, but it was always meaningful, and she knew her father's quiet strength had given her lessons she would carry forever. One evening, Michael sat on the porch of his home, watching the sun set behind the hills surrounding Willow Creek. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the town below was calm yet alive. Candles from the square flickered in distant windows, a reminder of the nights when voices had first been raised and change had begun. Emily sat beside him, leaning against his shoulder. "Dad," she said softly, "do you ever feel proud of everything that happened?" Michael looked out at the town, thinking about the journey from that fateful night when he had been mocked to the moment Willow Creek had truly awakened. "I feel grateful," he said, "grateful that people found their voices, that dignity was restored, and that our community learned what it truly means to stand together. Pride comes naturally when you see goodness take root in the hearts of others." Emily smiled, feeling a sense of hope and inspiration that only her father could instill. As night fell, Willow Creek settled into a peaceful rhythm. The story of Michael, once just a quiet doctor, had become a symbol of courage and change. People remembered the moment on the street not with anger, but with admiration for the calm strength that sparked unity. Officer Daniel's departure served as a reminder that actions have consequences, and that integrity is the foundation of true authority. In the years to come, Michael's story would be told to children in schools, shared in town meetings, and remembered whenever someone faced a moment of injustice. It was not a story of revenge, but of accountability, courage, and the power of one individual to inspire a whole community. And through it all, Michael continued to walk quietly, live humbly, and care deeply, showing that real change begins not with loud words, but with steady hearts and unwavering integrity.